Tonight, President Joe Biden is betting on a big win in the state that propelled him to the Democratic nomination back in 2020. 55 delegates are up for grabs in South Carolina's first-in-the-nation Democratic primary after the DNC stripped New Hampshire of its delegates for refusing to comply with the party's official nominating calendar, putting South Carolina first. Now, this is the first time that South Carolina has appeared at the front of the official Democratic nominating calendar, and that was a change made largely at the request of President Biden. He is far and away the overwhelming favorite in this Democratic field, facing minimal competition from Minnesota Congressman Dean Phillips and author Marianne Williamson. CNN's Eva McKend is on the ground in South Carolina. So, Eva, without much of a competition here for the Democratic nomination and for President Biden himself, why is the state still so important for him?
You know, Alex, I have two words for you: black voters. When you speak to Democrats, they describe black voters as the backbone of the party. 60% of South Carolina Democrats are African American, and so they are looking to this population and this contest as instructive about what lies ahead. Saturday's South Carolina primary will serve as an early test of President Joe Biden's standing with a loyal constituency, black voters.
You're the reason I am president. You're the reason Kamala Harris is historic vice president. And you're the reason Donald Trump is a defeated former president.
While the president is expected to win the first official Democratic contest, the results could signal how much work he has to do to shore up support with a critical piece of his coalition ahead of an expected rematch with Donald Trump in November.
We need somebody who speaks to black Americans in the United States, and I don't think that either or are doing so.
Gabrielle Fant is a server at Hannibal's Kitchen, a must-stop for political candidates visiting Charleston, including the president just last week.
I'm a seventh generation in South Carolina, so I've seen the hardships black people go through, and no one is addressing that. And economically, we are at the bottom.
Not even FaceTime with the president has changed her mind. Her economic anxieties too great.
We need a candidate who's going to stand up and stand up strong for us, or we're voting for the couch.
So you're considering staying home and not voting?
Yes, and a lot of us are.
History reminds us to never forget that there was a time when we did not have that choice.
Dr. Tanya Matthews is the CEO of the International African American Museum in Charleston. She says black voters have created the organizing power to elevate issues vital to them, like fair wages, housing development, and small business support.
We think about the ancestors who died to fight for this, but we also think about aunts and uncles that are currently poll workers. When we see encouragement or strong turnout or strong voices in places like South Carolina, it is a note to the rest of the country, not just to other black voters, that black voters are paying attention.
The significance is not lost on shop owner Mimi Striplin, who met Biden last month with other South Carolina entrepreneurs. With this administration, she says she feels like she has a seat at the table and her voice is valued.
I think that we have to be able to step back and think a little more long term. Like, yes, 4 years, 8 years feels like a long time in my lifetime, but we think about these changes and how they are hopefully going to be impacting the next generations to come.
She worries about what another Trump presidency would bring.
It could be chaos all over again. Like, there were days that I just wake up as a person of color in this state in fear for my life, and that shouldn't be the case for anyone. And so, of course, there are definitely worries and fears around that.
National Democrats are leaning into those concerns, hoping they will motivate voters to turn out while also making an affirmative argument for Biden.
Diabetes and heart attack. There are a lot of ways that we've been trying to make things more affordable for working people. Student loan debt. We have seen the lowest unemployment for black folks in 50 years. We've seen this president work to cut childhood poverty in half, particularly in black communities.
Many are ready to give Biden another 4 years to continue making the case.
I'm always in support of Biden because on the inside, I think he's fair. On the inside, I think he's fair. I don't think Barack Obama would have had him a part of the team if he wasn't. And I'm a firm believer of Barack Obama.
But it may not be enough to convince some black voters weary of supporting Democrats again.
I'm telling black people, stay home.
So, Alex, things have been relatively quiet at this polling site here in Columbia. Just about 181 people showed up at this site to vote today, but still Democrats in this state expressing optimism, telling us 76% of early and absentee ballots came from black voters. So there was several days of early voting in this state, and they're confident in those numbers. But time will tell, Alex. The polls close in just about half an hour.
All right, Eva McKend on the ground there in Columbia, South Carolina. Thank you so much for that report. And coming up, back to our breaking news tonight. The U.S. and a number of allies conducting a new wave of airstrikes against the Houthis in Yemen. We'll have new details when we come back. Stay with us. We want to get back to tonight's top story. A U.S.-led coalition of countries hit 36 Houthi targets across 13 different areas in Yemen. CNN's Priscilla Alvarez is in Los Angeles, where the president is holding a fundraising event tonight. So, Priscilla, he's fundraising, but keeping a close eye on what's happening in the Middle East.
He is. He's closely monitoring all of it. And two senior administration officials tell me that President Biden gave the green light earlier this week, specifically on Monday, for these strikes to happen. Now, of course, these are separate from the retaliatory measures that we saw unfold on Friday. That was in response to the 3 American service members that were killed in Jordan. These strikes are part of an ongoing campaign with a coalition of countries. And the president had previously approved multilateral strikes against the Houthis to defend U.S. vessels and commercial vessels in the region. This has been an ongoing activity by the Houthis that have raised alarm within the administration because it really does threaten the global economy. Some of these commercial vessels have had to avoid the area, and it has become of increasing concern to many of those in that region. But of course, this is just one of many things that the president is having to navigate in this region as he tries to avoid being pulled into a wider regional war. And a senior administration official stressed to me that these strikes in Yemen were not intended to escalate any conflict in the region, but rather directly related to the Houthis' actions in the Red Sea and taken to prevent, or at least to deter them from continuing these actions. Now, of course, the U.S. officials have repeatedly said that these strikes are intended to degrade the Houthis' capabilities. Whether or not that has had an effect sort of remains to be seen, because we're still seeing that activity. But the president, at the very least, did approve these strikes to happen earlier in the week. Alex?
Yeah, the president walking a very fine line of trying to deter and not escalate the situation. Thank you, Priscilla Alvarez in Los Angeles, where the president is arriving for a fundraising swing. We are staying with this breaking news. There's lots more to discuss. Stay with us. We're taking a quick break. Be right back. We are closing in on 1 month since a D.C. appeals court heard arguments on Trump's claim that he is immune from prosecution for actions that he took while in the White House because he was president. And while we wait for that appeal to play out, the federal election subversion case against the former president has now been put on hold. Judge Tanya Chutkan has formally vacated the trial date that had been scheduled for early next month, March 4th. So let's discuss this with defense attorney and former federal prosecutor Shan Wu. Shan, thanks so much for joining me. So this isn't totally surprising because they're still trying to figure out the immunity claim. But when that date is vacated and it's essentially taken off of the docket, what's the impact of that?
Well, it's possible for a new date to be selected after the Court of Appeals decision comes down that theoretically could still be in time to stay out of the red zone for the election. But the formal vacating of it means that now it's officially off the docket. I think earlier we saw some reporting that Judge Chutkan had scheduled another trial on that date. That by itself isn't that significant. Judges will sometimes double book things because you never know if the trial is going to go. But the formal vacating of that date indicates that it's clear to her it's not going to start on that date.
So supposed to start on March 4th. Do you think that this is going to be delayed by a lot? And isn't it? It's true that this is the Trump legal team's preference, isn't it? That this gets delayed and drags on longer.
Oh, absolutely. That's been their preference from the beginning. The more delay there is, the better for them. This is a hard situation. The delay with the D.C. Circuit Federal Court of Appeals, the delay, it's not particularly unusual. I mean, sometimes Courts of Appeals takes months for a decision. But here, they clearly know that there's a clock ticking, and people are, of course, very anxious to find out. And given the gravity of the decision for them, they're probably having some wrangling going on behind the scenes as to even who's being assigned to write the opinion and what is the analysis going to be.
Do they prioritize this because of the importance of who is involved and the fact that this is an election year?
I think they do prioritize it in the sense of the timing. I think it's quite plain to them that the clock matters here. So I think everyone's been saying this, but I do think we're going to be seeing that decision sometime soon. It's not going to be months from now.
And could it be delayed even farther if this court decides that he is not immune, because then the expectation would be an appeal to the Supreme Court?
Yes, that could happen. They would probably first, Trump's team would probably first try to do what's called an en banc, meaning get the entire D.C. Circuit to hear it, and after that they would almost certainly try to go to the Supreme Court.
And then speaking of the Supreme Court, we will hear arguments next week to review the Colorado ruling that barred Trump from being on the ballot for the Republican primary because of his role in January 6th. So what are you watching for in those arguments?
Well, if we think there's behind-the-scenes wrangling going on with the D.C. Circuit, that's going to be nothing compared to the Supreme Court. We'd love to be a fly on the wall for that. I think what's going to happen there is the Supreme Court's going to be looking for some kind of an off-ramp here. They feel that they really need to supply some kind of uniformity for the cases across the country, and yet they're going to be very cautious about really wading into the merits too much. So, for example, they can look for off-ramps in the manner of process. They could look at Colorado and say, wasn't sufficient process here for the kind of decision they made. They could also punt to Congress and say, you really need to have a congressional finding in cases like this. So we'll have to see which way they go, but I would be surprised if they really want to wade too much into the substance, because what they want to do is to find a way to resolve it, but also not to make themselves the target for more political criticism.
Yeah, not appearing eager to get involved in election politics. At the state level, let's talk about what's happening in Georgia. We saw these court filings just yesterday. The Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis, and the filings were concerning Willis and the special prosecutor Nathan Wade. And in them, it was confirmed that there was a, quote, personal relationship between the two. But Willis denied that Wade had benefited financially from his being hired. What's your take on those filings that we saw?
I think those filings really provide the basis for saying that there's no there there. I believe those filings, including an affidavit, indicated at the time he was hired there's no personal relationship. Even if there had been, that doesn't go to the question of any prejudice to the defendants in the case. Maybe it's a sort of an HR kind of issue where they're hiring someone she's involved with. Even now, if there is a personal relationship of some kind, there's no prejudice to a defendant because they're on the same side. Two prosecutors having a relationship doesn't affect things. So one would think this might put the matter to rest, but the politics are so highly charged there that I'm sure she will continue to be the target of investigations, including there's like a political committee, a legislative committee that's trying to oversee her now in Georgia.
Yeah, they're not on opposing sides of this case. All right, Shan Wu, thank you very much for tackling all those different cases. Much appreciated.
Good to see you.
California officials are putting evacuation orders in place near Los Angeles as they warn about a major rain event that could last for days. We'll have the latest on that next. Stay with us. A strong atmospheric river is bearing down on Southern California, which is expected to bring life-threatening flooding conditions, The Weather Prediction Center now saying that parts of the region are under a rare high excessive flood risk. That's a level 4 out of 4 for tomorrow's storm. Now, evacuation orders have now been issued for Ventura County and parts of Santa Barbara County. CNN's Camila Bernal joins us now from Los Angeles. So, Camila, how are people preparing there?
Hey, Alex, so in some of those areas that you mentioned in Santa Barbara and Ventura, people are being told to leave their homes because those areas are particularly vulnerable. In other cases, people are also just being told to have basic preparations, meaning keeping up with the information, having an emergency kit, and stopping by your local fire station just to grab some sandbags. That's exactly what a lot of these people here are doing. I spoke to many of them who've come throughout the day. We've seen the piles of sand essentially go down and get filled again. You see they put more sand over here because of the amount of people that were coming in throughout the day. And I want you to listen to what one of the LA residents told me when he was here to pick up some sand. Once you saw, it may be a bit.
We need to prepare for the worst and definitely protect our house. Bringing the sandbags over to the house, making sure we put silicone wherever necessary on the outside of any windows that may possibly have had past water intrusion, and just making sure we have some backup batteries for our flashlights and other electronic devices.
So you guys are ready?
As good as we can be.
And now officials here in California have said this. They have water rescue teams that are already and ready to go. They have helicopters and air teams that are also prepared. They say they have crews ready in case of power outages or downed trees. They've also had people throughout LA County going to the homeless population and encouraging them to leave, to go to a shelter, especially those in areas that normally flood. And overall, the general public is being told, look, those currents can be very deceiving. So don't drive through any of the water, don't walk through any of the water, and take it seriously because it can be dangerous. Alex?
Yeah, that is a huge area of California from north of San Francisco to south of Los Angeles that is now under flood watch. Camila Bernal, thank you very much for that report. A crucial test for President Joe Biden and his bid for re-election as South Carolina's Democratic primary gives us some idea of how much support he has with black voters. You're in the CNN Newsroom. You are live in the CNN Newsroom. I'm Alex Marquardt in New York, in tonight for Jim Acosta. Thank you very much for joining me. We have breaking news. Polls are about to close in the nation's first official Democratic primary of this 2024 presidential campaign season. Tonight, 55 delegates are up for grabs in South Carolina, which you may recall propelled President Biden to the 2020 nomination after a series of bruising defeats. Now, Biden is far and away the overwhelming favorite in tonight's primary. He's facing minimal competition from Minnesota Congressman Dean Phillips and author Marianne Williamson. We will continue to monitor those South Carolina results as they come in and bring you complete up-to-the-minute analysis. But first, we are also following breaking news in the Middle East, where Iran-backed Houthi rebels are vowing tonight to retaliate after a new round of airstrikes by the U.S. and the United Kingdom in Yemen. They were also supported by several other countries. Today, the group of countries hit at least 30 Houthi targets across more than a dozen different locations. Senior Biden administration officials say that President Biden approved these strikes earlier in the week. Now, all of this is coming just a day after the U.S. launched other airstrikes. Those were retaliatory strikes against Iran-backed militants in both Iraq and in Syria. Those followed the deadly drone attack last weekend on Sunday on U.S. troops in Jordan that left 3 American service members dead. CNN's international diplomatic editor Nick Robertson is live in Israel with more on what this could mean for the region. But first, let's get straight to CNN's Oren Lieberman at the Pentagon. So, Oren, unlike last night's strikes in Iraq and Syria, today's the U.S. did not conduct alone.
That's right. This was once again conducted with the UK. This is the third time the two nations have operated together to strike Houthi targets in Yemen. The message effectively coming out together from these countries, saying that they find the ongoing attacks from the Iran-backed rebel group on international shipping completely unacceptable, especially because they have targeted U.S. and UK commercial vessels and warships. Now, it is worth noting here that there were a number of countries backing them, including Australia, Bahrain, Denmark, Canada, the Netherlands, and New Zealand, offering not only diplomatic support, but different kinds of perhaps operational or logistical support for this operation. And we've seen that happen as well, a measure of how grave not just the U.S. and the U.K. view this, but also all of these other countries involved because of the effect that the Houthi attacks have had on the global economy, on international shipping, considering they have targeted some of the world's most important international waterways. This set of targets, 36 targets across 13 different locations in Yemen, according to U.S. Central Command. And the list of different types of targets here, I'll read this off from their statement: multiple underground storage facilities, command and control, missile systems, UAV storage and operation sites, radars, and helicopters. In these pictures you see on your screen now, these are FA-18 fighter jets launching from the deck of the Ike, as well as a destroyer here launching Tomahawk cruise missiles. All of that part of this attack here. And Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin warning that if the attacks on international shipping don't start, then these strikes on Houthi weaponry will continue. And again, it's noteworthy here that it's not just this joint operation here. The U.S. struck drones and anti-ship cruise missiles over the course of the last 24, 36 hours. So this is a much broader effort here. Alex, I'll make one final point here. You said in the intro here that President Joe Biden had approved this earlier in this week, and that's just as he approved earlier in this week the strikes in Iraq and Syria. This is how gravely the U.S. and the Biden administration view this, a determination to keep getting after this problem, even if the Houthis and some of the Iranian-backed militias in Iraq and Syria vow to continue their attacks. The U.S. not deterred from acting here as well. And finally, I'll point out that in Iraq and Syria, Austin says U.S. operations there, the U.S. response to the attack last Sunday that killed 3 U.S. service members, wounded scores more, that's not over yet.
Yeah, they were certainly anticipating the need to carry out these strikes. So, Oren, at the Pentagon, thank you very much. Nick Robertson, to you, the Houthis are now vowing to respond to the strikes by this international coalition. This message of deterrence doesn't seem to be working.
It doesn't, but it's rhetoric from the Houthis at the moment saying they'll meet escalation with escalation. However, over the past few weeks since these strikes began, about 3 weeks ago, the Houthis have continued to target international shipping passing through the Red Sea. So I think despite the fact they're going to, once they've done their own battle damage assessment, they may find that they have lost a lot more equipment than they anticipated. This is a fighting force that went through about 8 years of war with Saudi Arabia, much of that under Saudi airstrikes that were, by the way, helped with U.S. intelligence and U.S. Air refueling for some of those for some of the Saudi fighter jets involved in the bombing. So the Houthis feel that they've been through this sort of thing before, perhaps not on this scale, perhaps not with the reach that the United States and capacity of the United States and its allies can put on the ground in Yemen. But the Houthis, for their part, are saying that they can withstand this and that they will come back and continue. And they have a track record of doing that. They're also saying that they're doing this because of to support the Palestinians in Gaza, and their point being, and that point being made by the Iranians as well, that if the war ends in Gaza, if there's a ceasefire there, then all the region will go quiet. But of course, the ceasefire that they're looking for is one that's on their terms, where Hamas comes out stronger, Israel comes out weaker, and the United States' interests in the region are weakened as well.
And big questions about to what extent Iran is trying to resupply those Houthis as they continue their fight. Nick Robertson in Tel Aviv, Oren Lieberman at the Pentagon. Thank you both. Let's bring in our panel of experts for more on this. Joining me now is CNN Global Affairs analyst Kim Dozier and CNN military analyst Lieutenant General Mark Hertling. Thank you both for being with me. General Hertling, I want to start with you just because we heard Oren Lieberman rattle off that list of targets, including underground facilities, missile systems, storage sites. This seems like a rather broad range of targets, some 36 of them in 13 different locations. So to what extent do you think, General, that the U.S. and its coalition partners have been effective at degrading Houthi capabilities? Because it doesn't seem like they've been effective at deterring them.
Yeah, I believe, based on the number of targets and the type of weaponry that was used, based on what the over-the-counter intelligence is saying, the so-called OSINT, that it was both an air and a cruise missile strike, Alex. So that's going to strike a lot of targets that are conducive to the Houthis continuing to attack the sea-based platforms, the shipping that's going through the area. They talked about the underground targets. When you're discussing any force that lives in fights in the deserts, like the Houthis do, there's no cover and concealment for the kind of equipment or the ammo caches they have. So the type of attacks have to strike into these deeply buried targets. We're seeing that in Israel and Gaza with what the IDF is fighting against Hamas. The Houthis use the same kind of approach where they bury the things they're using, the rockets, the missiles, the equipment. So it's much more difficult to strike and destroy those targets. But I think with what we're talking about here, the number of aircraft and sea-launched ballistic missiles that have gone into this strike, I would suggest they have been deteriorated quite a bit tonight. And this is, again, the first night against the Houthis. There's going to be more.
Kim, the name of the game for the Biden administration seems to be knock it off. We're trying to deter you while also not escalate things, like taking powerful enough action to not escalate. And there has been some criticism that those two things are essentially in conflict with each other. So moving from the Red Sea and the Houthis up to Iraq and Syria, we saw a rather powerful set of strikes last night. 7 different facilities, 85 different targets against these Iranian-backed groups. The Biden administration making clear they see this just as an opening response for that strike last weekend by militants that killed 3 American service members. How do you think the Biden administration is walking this line in carrying out powerful, they hope, deterrent strikes while also not going beyond what they feel would be a line that would cause escalation?
Well, what I think we're seeing is the beginning of a low-grade campaign in both the Iraq and Syria area and against the Houthis in Yemen, in that the Biden administration knows, though it's not going to say out loud to the American public, that it's not going to take away the will to fight of either sets of groups, especially when they're all backed by Iran, which has been opportunistic about looking for moments to strike the U.S. or U.S. targets with some sort of padding in between so they have deniability. So what you're going to see is they take out a number of targets, then they watch. They do battle damage assessment, as Mark was talking about. They see who moves where, and they rack them up for the next time. So each time they get a little bit more, understanding that it's not going to get down to 0, but hopefully it'll get in the Red Sea, fewer attacks such that some shipping can start again, and in the Iraq and Syria area that they send enough of a strong message that they just quiet it for a time, weeks, maybe months.
General Hertling, we've heard time and time again from the Biden administration that their goal is to not expand this conflict beyond Gaza, to not escalate this conflict. But it is both expanding and escalating, is it not? I mean, we're seeing these bigger and bigger strikes like today and last night. We've now seen Jordan essentially joining the list of countries impacted because of that strike last weekend. So is it not expanding and escalating in front of our very eyes?
Yeah, you bring up a very good point, Alex. This is not a proportional response. This is total destruction of some of the equipment of both the Houthis and the PMFs in Iraq and Syria. That's what I think is needed, truthfully. You know, for all of the individuals who are saying, strike Tehran, strike inside of Iran, what I'd suggest from a military doctrinal and theoretical perspective, hate to get deep on all of us here, but the center of gravity of the Iranian government are these PMFs, are these proxy forces. So if you can destroy or at least hinder their continued operation, it causes the regime in Iran to think twice. This is their strength. This is how they conduct strategy, by deploying these multi-phased rebel groups, as well as supporting elements like the Houthis in Yemen, like Hezbollah in northern Israel, southern Lebanon. Those are their kingpins. That's who they rely on. So the continued strikes against those groups will actually deter the Iranian regime. It's a smart move, in my view, from a military perspective. Is it going to completely destroy them, as Israel said they want to do to Hamas? No, it's not. What might be interesting, Alex, is the day after these strikes occur, there may be a missile shot at a seaborne vehicle in the Red Sea. We have to expect that. They will continue to fight on, but I think each one of these strikes that are being conducted against these Iranian proxies is depleting their capability, and they believe that, and so do the Quds Force that are supporting them.
Kim, are you seeing any indication from Tehran that they hope to escalate this? I mean, they have said that, we will respond if need to, or do you think Iran and the IRGC are content to keep it at kind of this level of conflict, this lower level simmer of essentially stirring the pot on these various different fronts?
Well, what we see right now is they're playing the reasonable actor card. They are saying the U.S. is being irresponsible. The U.S. has taken aggressive action, and that plays across the Middle East and parts of the global South really well. It makes the U.S. look like the bad guy again. Iran, what it usually does is strikes in secret, waits until later, bides its time. It's going to see how all these strikes add up in both Iraq and Syria and Yemen. And its long-term strategy is, if it could get U.S. troops out of Iraq, for instance, one of its major areas of influence, that would mean they have greater control over the Iraqi government. Whereas while the Iraqi leadership is saying they want the U.S. out, if you talk to Iraqi officials privately, they want to keep U.S. troops on the ground because essentially they play Washington off of Tehran. You take Washington out of that equation, they could get gobbled up by the Iranian regime.
Yeah, Iraq is in a truly unique place between Iran and the United States. General Mark Hertling, Kim Dozier, thank you very much for your thoughts this evening. And still ahead, we are waiting for the results from the South Carolina Democratic primary. We will have analysis after the break. You're in the CNN Newsroom. And there is breaking news tonight. Polls are now closed in the nation's first official Democratic primary of the 2024 race. Tonight, 55 delegates are up for grabs in South Carolina, which propelled President Joe Biden to the 2020 nomination after a series of bruising defeats. Now, it is the first time that South Carolina has appeared at the front of the official Democratic nominating calendar. That was a change that was made largely at the president's request. Now, Biden is far and away the overwhelming favorite in this field. He's facing minimal competition from Minnesota Congressman Dean Phillips and the author, Marianne Williamson. Tonight, Biden is betting on a big win, and he does appear confident to achieve a strong showing. Now, rather than stumping and being campaigning in South Carolina, he has his eyes on the future, on the general election, embarking on a fundraising swing through Southern California and Nevada. In South Carolina, the Biden campaign will be closely watching turnout from the black community, which was instrumental in securing his victory in 2020. And while polling indicates that black voters overwhelmingly back Joe Biden over Donald Trump, the former president is making small inroads as Biden's approval rating in the crucial voting bloc continues to wane. I want to bring in two of our top experts, CNN Chief National Affairs Correspondent Jeff Zeleny and Senior Political Analyst Ron Brownstein. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us tonight. Ron, to you first. There isn't much competition. You've got Phillips and Williamson in the field as well. So what is the Biden campaign going to be watching for in these returns?
Yeah, I think they're looking for enthusiasm and turnout. But that isn't the sole issue he faces with the black community this year. I mean, traditionally, Democrats have worried pretty much solely about mobilizing black voters, maximizing turnout, and the question was whether people would show up. This year, Biden has an issue as well with persuasion. I mean, he faces the risk given the discontent over his performance, particularly about the economy and inflation and the strain that it puts on voters near the median income of any race, he faces a risk of potentially a significant gender gap among black voters. I mean, there are some indications, in polling so far that the gender gap among both black and brown voters could be bigger than among white voters. So he has some work to do, not only on the usual front that Democrats worry about of ginning up excitement, but he also has work to do about reeling back in some black male voters and Hispanic male voters who in polls are expressing dissatisfaction with his record and some receptivity and openness to Donald Trump.
And Jeff, if this is the end of the road for Dean Phillips, what did the Democratic Party gain or lose by his participating in this primary?
Well, Alex, probably not much on either side. The reality is many Democrats outside of these early primary states likely did not even know that he was running. Dean Phillips, of course, a Minnesota member of Congress, tried to spark a conversation. He tried to spark a competition inside the Democratic primary base, but it really just never happened. So we will see how he does tonight in South Carolina, but he campaigned so aggressively in New Hampshire. And of course, that was a write-in vote for Joe Biden, but it's hard to imagine him doing any better. Look, but one thing it does overall, the fact that President Biden has escaped a serious primary challenge is so significant for him. History will show that when a president has a primary challenge, they have a general election problem on their hands. So by escaping a serious primary challenge, that is probably one of the best things that this White House has going for it. But look, Dean Phillips has spent a lot of money. It's hard to imagine him doing much tonight, but we shall see. But as Ron was saying, what the Biden campaign and the White House is looking for is to spark some interest and enthusiasm, particularly among black voters, that they're listening to his message. But the turnout is not expected to be very high. I mean, the early voting and absentee voting was actually higher than 4 years ago, but that was a very aggressive campaign. So we shall see tonight. But the reality is I'm not sure we'll be able to draw all that much from the results tonight in South Carolina, how it speaks to the bigger challenges here facing the White House.
Well, let's see if we can draw anything. I'm told some of the first results are coming in, and we're going to put them up on the screen. There you see Biden winning leading overwhelmingly with 97.3%, both Marianne Williamson and Dean Phillips with 1.6 and 1.1%, respectively. Ron Brownstein, any reaction there?
Well, to Jeff's point, it is what isn't happening is important, like the dog that isn't barking. The fact that a serious primary challenge to Biden never developed and is unlikely to develop here tonight. It's especially significant because so many Democrats consistently say in polls they wanted an alternative. I believe in the CNN poll we released this week, Jeff can fact check me on this, something like half or even slightly more than half of Democrats said they wanted another alternative in 2024. There was some appetite and audience among the base voters who are concerned about Biden, but the leadership of the party locked arms around him in a way that basically precluded any serious challenge. I mean, this was an example of that old political science saying that the party decides, which was viewed to be kind of ridden into the dust by Trump's emergence in 2016. The party decided here in 2024 that there would not be a serious challenge to Biden. And the real impact of South Carolina, we're going to have to wait until 2028 because it is a very big deal, as Joe Biden would say, that this state with its racial composition is going to be the leadoff state on the Democratic calendar, as opposed to virtually all white Iowa and New Hampshire. But we're not going to see that impact now. It's going to be on the race to succeed Biden as the next Democratic nominee in 2028.
I think he might put it a little differently than really big deal, as he famously did.
Exactly.
Jeff, you just got back from Michigan, and we are seeing something of a progressive revolt, a real outrage among not just Arab and Muslim American voters, but also to some extent black voters over the president's handling of the war in Gaza, the full-throated support that this administration continues to express for Israel in its war against Hamas. What did you hear from those voters?
Alex, this is a very real challenge for President Biden, and the White House, of course, is very well aware of this. But Ron was talking about the gender breakdown and the gender gap. That is definitely true. There's also an age concern here. The younger voters we speak to, yes, in Michigan, but beyond that, they have real reservations about what this administration, what this president has done in terms of a full embrace of Israel. Now, we have seen, a shifting in language, and we saw the executive order this week, but that did very little to ease some of these concerns. So I think the biggest question of all facing the president over the next 9 months, can he re-piece together that coalition that really sent him to the White House of younger voters, older voters, certainly Latino voters, black voters, and there are real concerns about that. I talked to a reverend in Detroit just a couple days ago, and he said that there is, economic concerns, sure, but simply voters do not know necessarily what this administration did. They still remember, in some respects, the checks that Donald Trump sent out. Of course, the Biden administration has passed significant legislation, but it's been so huge in many respects, from infrastructure to other things, that people don't necessarily know how it's affecting them. So the burden and the challenge is on this White House to make that case. But this coalition is certainly a challenge for the president to rebuild.
All right, and we do have an update in terms of those returns. I'm told that Joe Biden is now the projected winner of the South Carolina Democratic primary. And that is a CNN projection. That Joe Biden will be the winner of the South Carolina Democratic primary. You can see it right there as we have it with the votes that are in so far. Some 97.3% are going for Joe Biden. Ron Brownstein, I want to pick up where Jeff was what he was talking about, that coalition. I think certainly when it comes to Michigan and the war in Gaza, there is a sense there that there are so many Arab and Muslim Americans and some of those black voters who want to see a ceasefire, who are calling for a ceasefire. But if the president were to say that, he could also lose support elsewhere. How important do you think the war in Gaza is going to be in terms of rebuilding that coalition that he had in 2020?
Yeah, well, I think it is critical geographically because of, as Jeff was pointing out, the importance of that vote in Michigan. Joe Biden is president because 5 states flipped from supporting Trump in 2016 to supporting Biden in 2020. And those were Arizona, Georgia in the Sun Belt, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin in the industrial Midwest. Arizona and especially Georgia look a lot tougher for him than they did in 2020. The shortest path to 270 for Biden is holding Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. He has reason for reasonable optimism in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. But the polling in Michigan has been troubling for him, in part, only in part, but certainly in part because of this potential defection among Arab American voters. It's not easy to replace Michigan in a Democratic map. He needs to get this right. One test will be there is an effort to have Arab American voters write in uncommitted, which Jeff probably knows more about than I do, in the Michigan primary, which would be maybe a measure of how broad this discontent is. But Biden does, I think, have a big political problem, and it is compounded by the fact that he is in partnership with someone in Bibi Netanyahu who probably does not want him to win. I mean, Netanyahu has identified with the Republican Party over the last 30 years more closely than any foreign leader, I believe, in my lifetime has identified with either American party. And I think there's no question that he would rather be dealing with Donald Trump in the White House. So he has embraced someone who, at the margin, is really, I don't think, looking to do him any favors in how he, conducts this conflict. And it is creating a source of pressure for Biden in an absolutely critical and possibly irreplaceable state for him in trying to reach 270 electoral college votes.
Yeah, President Biden out in Michigan earlier this week to take something of a victory lap with labor workers and labor support, but has certainly highlighted the lack of support that he's seeing elsewhere in the party. I want to bring in our Eva McKend, who is in Columbia, South Carolina. We have just made this projection, Eva, that President Joe Biden has won the South Carolina Democratic primary. What are you hearing there?
Well, Alex, the polls have just closed, the ballots being wheeled out as we speak. All day long we've been speaking to voters, and they were largely supportive of President Biden. We actually even met a voter who supported Trump in 2016 and 2020. Republican, longtime Republican, but now says that he's worried about the future of American democracy, the preservation of our Constitution, and that's why he's supporting this president. We also spoke to a number of black voters, and their views entirely mixed, Alex. One woman telling us that she was not feeling that she was economically suffering and that she's tired of historically voting for Democrats and feeling like she isn't getting that much from it. But other people who are really excited about President Biden, especially because he was former President Barack Obama's vice president. And then more pragmatic voters we heard from, Alex, who say that they are really principally worried about Trump returning to the White House. But this was not a surprising outcome tonight, but really still a consequential state for President Biden. This was the state that resurrected his campaign in 2020. And so we are going to get the sense, as we really comb through these results here, what black voter sentiment is in this region and perhaps throughout the country. Alex.
All right, Eva McKend in Columbia, South Carolina, stay with us. I want to come back to you. But Jeff Zeleny, you know, this was not a surprise, as Eva was just saying, and yet it was considered important enough for the White House to deploy Kamala Harris in the lead up to this primary.
Certainly. She was holding a rally just last evening in Orangeburg, as Eva knows. She was there. And the reality is, as Ron was saying earlier, South Carolina is also about 2028. But more importantly, it is about essentially what role Vice President Harris is going to play in this campaign. She's remarkably popular among black voters, particularly older black women voters. That is a key part of the Democratic constituency. But I think it's something of a roadmap of what she will do for the rest of this year. She's been essentially weaponized by Republicans. We've heard Nikki Haley, who's also still in the race in South Carolina. And to people who may be wondering what's happening on the Republican side, we should point out the Republican primary is not until February 24th. So that's a few more weeks here to campaign. But she has been, Nikki Haley, the former governor there, has been campaigning aggressively against Kamala Harris, saying a vote for Joe Biden is a vote for a President Harris. Well, so she's being weaponized by Republicans, but she's essentially the weapon for Democrats to drum up a turnout. So this is something that we're going to be watching over the next 9 months, what role she is going to play in this campaign. It's a very big one, of course, for President Biden. But as Eva was saying, 4 years ago tonight, it revived and relaunched Joe Biden's path to the White House. They're hoping it does the same thing tonight, but boy, things are so much different than they were 4 years ago, not just on the policy set and things happening around the world, but for the president himself. He's a very different candidate. In some respects, he's older, and voters are open-endedly raising concerns about that. So tonight, certainly a good moment for Joe Biden winning, but the hard work is still to come and still ahead of him.
It certainly is, and it's going to be a lot of hard work. Not a surprise, but really certainly a lot that we can learn from this primary tonight. And again, CNN has now projected that Joe Biden will win the Democratic primary in South Carolina. Ron Brownstein, Jeff Zeleny, Eva McKend, thank you all very much. And still ahead, we are talking with a member of President Biden's re-election campaign about the campaign strategy to keep the White House. Stay with us. And we have some breaking news. CNN is projecting that President Joe Biden has won South Carolina's first in the nation Democratic primary today. He paid a visit to his campaign headquarters and taking the opportunity to rally staff ahead of what's shaping up to be a challenging rematch against his likely Republican rival, former President Donald Trump.
This is not just a campaign. This is more of a mission. We cannot lose this campaign for the good of the country. We're going to be able to say, God willing, that this generation help save democracy.
Let's discuss more now with the Biden campaign's communications director, Michael Tyler. Michael, thank you so much for being with us this evening. Congratulations on winning South Carolina. We have just made that projection. Your campaign is counting on a strong showing among black voters in South Carolina. They, of course, helped launch Biden to the White House back in 2020. So what do you say to Democrats who are arguing that the president now has an enthusiasm problem among voters of color?
Well, I thank you so much for having me. I've looked at tonight, right? You have Joe Biden once again coming out on top as a winner because of his commitments, keeping his promises to black voters who have been the backbone of the Democratic Party. Look at the results tonight in South Carolina. You have Joe Biden cruising to victory in an election where black voters were looking at the early vote data. They're making up 76% of the electorate. That's compared to about 56% in 2020. And so black voters turned out in South Carolina because they understand that Joe Biden has kept his promises. He kept his promise by making sure that South Carolina went first in the nominating calendar. And he's kept his promises throughout his first term in office, right? He promised to run and serve as a president who will put racial equity first. And so what the result has been things like record low black unemployment during the first term in office, black wealth up 60% since before the pandemic, historic investments into HBCUs, and capping the cost of insulin at $35. So this is a president who has made promises and has kept them. And so his promise now is to keep delivering for the American people over the course of the next 4 years. And that stands in stark contrast to Donald Trump, who wakes up every day thinking about how he's going to serve himself.
Yeah, Michael, this victory tonight, as happy as I'm sure you are about it, obviously doesn't come as a surprise. But as you dig into these numbers, what are you going to be looking for in terms of indications and things that your campaign needs to learn for the path forward in the general election?
Yeah, we're very excited to sort of springboard here into Nevada. The president is obviously out on the West Coast right now. He'll be campaigning in Nevada, reassembling the Biden-Harris coalition. I think if you're looking at other metrics that speak to the enthusiasm that we're seeing at this stage of the race, we just announced that January was our best grassroots fundraising month of the campaign, building off of December, which was the best month of grassroots fundraising month of our campaign so far. And so if you're looking for metrics, I think those types of fundraising metrics right now at this early stage of the race, when you pair that with what we're seeing in states like New Hampshire, where we had a grassroots writing campaign, and in South Carolina tonight, we are well on our way towards building the campaign infrastructure that we're going to need to beat Donald Trump in a general election.
But given how tight this race is likely to be with Donald Trump, who of course is he is expected to win the Republican nomination, though Nikki Haley is still in the race in South Carolina, since we're talking about South Carolina. You would think that the president would be trying to reach as many voters as possible. We've just gotten this news from CBS that the White House has turned down a request for the president to participate in that traditional interview before the Super Bowl. So I don't have to tell you, this is the night where I think more Americans tune in than any other night of the year. It is the most popular programming of the year. So why was that decision made?
Well, yeah, I'll certainly be tuning into the game, but I don't know about you. During pregame, I'm usually still making my chili or putting my beer in the cooler. So I don't know how many eyeballs we're going to lose during pregame coverage. This campaign is definitely going to do everything it needs to do to reach the voters who are going to decide this election. That's why we're running an ad during the Grammys tomorrow night, for example. It's why the president, when he's in states like South Carolina, is doing like a number of local radio interviews to speak to the voters who are actually going to be casting ballots. And it's why this campaign is going to work relentlessly to reach the voters across all platforms, paid media, digital organizing on the ground. We're going to speak directly to the voters who are going to decide this election consistently from now until November.
Yeah, but running an ad during the Grammys, I mean, that costs you something. This is free advertising, if you will. That this is millions and millions, tens of millions of eyeballs. So why would the president not want to do that? It seems like an easy decision.
Again, the president is going to continue to campaign and continue to hold interviews across the country from now through November. Not too concerned about pregame coverage right now in February of 2024. We're far more concerned about speaking directly to the voters who are going to decide this election in the early states and in the battleground states across the country. We're focused on our pathway to 270.
I wanted to ask you about some of our recent CNN polling that came out this week. I wanted to putting this up on the screen. 46% of Democratic and Democratic-leaning voters saying that the president's age is their biggest concern about him. We heard from former President Obama's senior advisor, David Axelrod. He was asked about this on CNN by my colleague, Dana Bash. Take a listen.
I think he has to address it. Both these guys are old, right? This isn't about their futures, okay? This is about the future of the country and the future of our kids and grandkids. And I think what he wants to focus people on is who's really focused on their future, who's doing things every day motivated by building a better future for their kids and grandkids, and who's consumed by his past and looking backward. And I think that contrast is pretty clear.
As the president goes to these early states and speak with the voters that you were just talking about, does he need to address this issue, which is at the front of so many voters' minds?
Well, listen, the American people know Joe Biden's age. They also know that with his age comes things like wisdom, like judgment, like experience. That's why they elected him in the first place. And I think Axelrod is right. When voters are concerned about their lives, they're not too concerned about the candidates. They want to know they want to know what the candidates are going to do for them. It's about the future. Are we going to restore Roe as the law of the land so that women can have their fundamental rights again? Are we going to continue to lower costs for Americans like the president has done by capping the cost of insulin, taking on big pharma and winning? Are we going to ban assault weapons and high-capacity magazines? Only one candidate is going to continue this work, and that's Joe Biden. Donald Trump is out here every single day rooting for the economy to crash. He's pledging to rule as a dictator on day one. He's trying to take away the Affordable Care Act once again. So as it relates to the voters, the choice is going to be fundamentally clear to them on Election Day, and the only choice is going to be Joe Biden.
All right, Michael Tyler, thanks again for joining us this evening, and congratulations on your first victory of this 2024 campaign season.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
All right. Still ahead, we continue to follow breaking news. The U.S.-led coalition of countries hit dozens of Houthi targets in Yemen. What officials tell CNN about when President Biden ordered those strikes? Here in the CNN newsroom. Stay with us. We are continuing to follow the breaking news this evening. CNN is projecting that President Joe Biden has won the South Carolina's first in the nation Democratic primary. But amid his bid for re-election, the president is also facing an escalating conflict, or perhaps series of conflicts, across the Middle East. Tonight, a U.S.-led coalition of countries hit dozens of Houthi targets in Yemen. CNN's Priscilla Alvarez is in Los Angeles, where the president is holding a fundraising event tonight. So, Priscilla, he is juggling both campaigning with a pretty active situation in the Middle East.
That's right, Alex. The two things colliding today as we've learned that those strikes happened at around the same time that President Biden was visiting his campaign headquarters earlier today. Now, two senior administration officials tell me that President Biden gave the green light for these strikes in Yemen to occur earlier this week. This is part of these multilateral strikes that have been going as part of this coalition of countries to defend vessels in the Red Sea, including commercial ships, against Houthi actions. Now, these two senior administration officials also telling me that these are separate from the retaliatory measures that we saw happen just yesterday when the U.S. hit those targets in Iraq and Syria, and that this is, again, part of the actions by this coalition to deter Houthis from their activities. Now, whether or not that is having an effect remains to be seen. The activity has continued. They have continued to try to strike these vessels, but the U.S. and its partner countries making clear here that they will not stand for it and engaging in these strikes. But again, Alex, to your earlier point, all of this colliding today as the president is also attending a campaign fundraiser here in Los Angeles while also trying to avoid a wider regional war in the Middle East.
Yeah, the Houthis vowing escalation for escalation, as they've said. Priscilla, has the Biden campaign responded to this win in South Carolina in the primary tonight, and what are they looking at next?
Yes, they have, Alex. We just got a statement from President Biden himself from the campaign in which he touts the results in South Carolina today and again reiterates that the stakes of the election are high. He reflects on 2020. And when the state really turned the tide for him during that election, he's repeatedly credited the state for helping launch him to victory in November of 2020. And he says some of the same in this statement, going on to say that now in 2024, the people of South Carolina have spoken again. And I have no doubt that you have set us on the path to winning the presidency again and making Donald Trump a loser again. Now, this is language that the president has started to use more often, and drawing a contrast with former President Donald Trump. I was with President Biden in South Carolina last week, where he was energizing, or he's trying to energize and mobilize black voters to the polls today. It seems as though he did just that based off the interview with Michael Tyler earlier, in which they are seeing more black voters make up the electorate this time around than in 2020.
And in calling Trump a loser, appearing to be trying to get under the former president's skin. Priscilla Alvarez in Los Angeles, thank you very much. We are staying with this breaking news after a quick break. A strong atmospheric rever is bearing down on Southern California, expected to bring life-threatening flooding. The Weather Prediction Center now saying parts of the region under a rare high excessive flood risk. That's a level 4 out of 4 for tomorrow's storm. Evacuation orders have now been issued for Ventura County and parts of Santa Barbara County. I want to stay with this story. CNN's Camila Bernal joins us now from Los Angeles. So, Camila, how are people there preparing for this event?
Hey, Alex. So there are obviously preparations underway in those counties with those evacuation orders, and authorities telling people to take those warnings very seriously. Authorities also saying there are easy ways to prepare, not traveling if you don't need to, having an emergency kit, just keeping up with information and stopping by your local fire station to grab some sandbags. That's what a lot of these people here are doing. Throughout the day, we've seen a steady flow of people who have told me that maybe their garages flood or their businesses or their homes. So this is a way to avoid that. Officials also saying that they have been preparing, and I want you to listen to what the fire chief said about what their preparations are.
We've got our swift water rescue apparatus boats. We also have our teams that will be fully staffed, ready to respond to any water-related emergency. Now, these teams are highly trained in swift water technical rescues. They stand ready to respond on a moment's notice. We've also bolstered our air apparatus, our helicopters, our air resources, adding skilled pilots and rescue teams to our helicopter fleet.
And there's now an emergency operation that will be activated throughout the state starting tomorrow. Again, officials just telling people to take these warnings very seriously. Alex?
And we certainly hope they do. Camila Bernal in Los Angeles, thank you very much. We'll have more news in a moment. Stay with us. You are in the CNN Newsroom. I'm Alex Marquardt in for Jim Acosta tonight. Thank you all so much for joining us. We're continuing to follow major news here in the United States as well as overseas. CNN is projecting that President Joe Biden has won South Carolina's first in the nation Democratic primary. Now, it's a major victory in that state, which propelled him to the nomination in 2020 after what was a series of really bruising defeats. The sweeping victory comes after he handily beat his opponents in New Hampshire's unofficial, unsanctioned primary. That was last month, as the president inches closer to securing his party's nomination and what will likely be a rematch against the former president, Donald Trump. But amid Biden's bid for re-election, the president is also facing an escalating conflict in the Middle East. A U.S.-led coalition carried out a series of strikes against Houthi rebels in Yemen earlier today. The group, which includes the United Kingdom and several other countries, struck at least 30 targets across more than a dozen locations. Senior Biden administration officials say that President Biden approved these strikes earlier this week. The Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin is calling it a clear message and says the U.S. will not hesitate to defend the free flow of commerce in that vital waterway, the Red Sea. But Iran is warning the U.S. is fueling further conflict in the region. All of this coming just a day after the U.S. launched other strikes against Iran-backed militants in both Syria and Iraq. Those were in response, the administration says, to those deadly drone strikes, the one attack, rather, last weekend on U.S. troops at a base in Jordan. We've got a team of reporters tracking all of the latest developments here at home and overseas. Let's get first to CNN's Oren Lieberman, who is live at the Pentagon. Oren, what more have we learned about today's strikes against the Houthis in Yemen?
Let's talk about these latest strikes here, and then we'll try to make a distinction between the U.S. and U.K. strikes in Yemen versus what happened yesterday in Iraq and Syria. So first, this coalition led by the U.S. and the U.K., also Canada, the Netherlands, Bahrain, and several other countries supporting, carried out strikes at 13 locations, 36 targets across those locations, according to U.S. Central Command and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. There on your screen are the countries supporting this operation. Central Command says they targeted underground storage facilities for weapons, command and control, missile systems, drone storage and operations sites, radars, and helicopters. Now, this is an ongoing response, and we have seen the U.S., the U.K., and this coalition do this twice before, as an ongoing response to continued Houthi attacks on international shipping lanes in the Red Sea and in the Gulf of Aden. The U.S. has warned that if these launches, these drone, missile, and cruise missile strikes on commercial vessels continue, so too will the U.S. strikes. The goal here is to try to disrupt the ability of the Houthis to target international shipping lanes and take away much of their weaponry. It is a tall order. The Houthis are supplied by Iran. They are an Iran-backed rebel group. But that's the goal here, and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin warning this will continue. Worth pointing out here that this is specifically in response to the Houthi attacks. That's as opposed to the U.S. strikes in Iraq and Syria yesterday. Those are in response to that the drone attack that killed 3 U.S. service members and wounded scores more last weekend. Although those were an order of magnitude larger than we've seen U.S. strikes in Iraq or Syria before, there is a warning from Austin, the defense secretary, that that is just the beginning of the U.S. response. Ultimately, although there is a distinction in the rationale between these strikes, they link back to Iran, certainly from the American perspective, and that is who is supposed to be the recipient of this message, Alex.
Yeah, the Pentagon clearly trying to delineate these different campaigns. Oren at the Pentagon, thank you very much. Nick Robertson, now to you in Tel Aviv. We're hearing the Houthis respond to these strikes. They are vowing to escalate as well. To Oren's point, today was the third set of these kinds of strikes. So this message of deterrence that the U.S. and others are trying to send to the Houthis, that doesn't seem to be working very well.
It doesn't, and I think that speaks to the reason to go after more targets. Of course, in any military campaign where it's airstrikes and you're targeting launchers on the ground, ammunition storage, launch facilities, command and control, all of these things, it is quite often a gradual process because you take out the easier to get ones, the ones that you know that they're using immediately. And since these strikes began 3 weeks ago, we've seen the Houthis continue with their attacks, oftentimes daily sending UAVs or missiles towards international shipping. Now, of course, all of that is being watched closely, and we've seen day by day the U.S. strike and knock down either UAV launches, UAVs in the air, or missiles just before they're about to be launched in the 1s and 2s and 3s and 4s. But what the surveillance and the spycraft will be doing during that time is looking at where these munitions come from. What are the storage sites? What are the Houthis using right now? So I think what we're seeing is now this graduation going after some of the more hard-to-get targets, if you will. And the Houthis have got a lot of hard-to-get targets because they fought an 8-year campaign against the Saudis, and the Saudis were trying to get the Houthis through airstrikes. So the Houthis got good at putting them in bunkers and caves in the mountains, and a lot of mountains in Yemen. So you take that intelligence and you take that into the battlefield and try to take out more of their equipment. But the Houthis are saying very simply, we will escalate. Now, it sounds like rhetoric, but the likelihood is they still have capability and capacity, and the likelihood is there will have to be more follow-on strikes here. And, of course, what they say they're aiming for, which is what Iran says they're aiming for, is to support the Palestinians in Gaza. That's what they're saying. What do they actually mean here when they say that? And the Iranians say, look, if you just get a ceasefire deal in Gaza, then of course everything's going to calm down in the region, the Houthis included, which is an Iranian proxy. What they really mean is make a ceasefire with Hamas right now, on better terms for Hamas, giving Israel poorer terms. It weakens Israel, weakens U.S. interests in the region. That's what Iran is about. And this is in essence what the Houthis are saying right now. We'll keep going until we get what we want, which is a weakened Israel.
All right, Nick Robertson in Tel Aviv, Oren Lieberman at the Pentagon. Thank you both very much. Turning back to the United States, Joe Biden touting his victory in the South Carolina Democratic primary, telling supporters that the stakes could not be higher. CNN's Jeff Zeleny joins us now with the details. So, Jeff, what are we hearing now from the president's campaign since tonight's victory?
Alex, of course, President Biden is accepting and declaring victory here, and they are quite happy about this. Of course, this is why that they changed the Democratic nominating calendar in the first place, to start in South Carolina. They believe a strong showing here will set the path going forward. And in a statement released just a few moments ago, the president said this. He said, "The people of South Carolina have spoken again, and I have no doubt that they have set us on a path to winning the presidency and making Donald Trump a loser." So clearly pointing out his likely rival as well. But Alex, we are limited in what we'll be able to learn from this, largely because most incumbent presidents have not had a situation like this. When Barack Obama was running for re-election in 2012, there was no primary. When Bill Clinton was running, there was no primary. So certainly how many people came to the polls today will be studied as a measure of enthusiasm. We're not expecting a record turnout, probably a record low turnout. But the Biden campaign believes this is the beginning of a pathway to invigorating black voters in particular, which make up a majority of the Democratic electorate in South Carolina. But look, the bottom line to all this, Alex, is the president is breathing a major sigh of relief that for all the angst and discontent in the party, he has not faced a major challenge in any of these primaries. Look at those results there. Marianne Williamson, Dean Phillips, so far behind. So most presidents who are challenged in primaries go on to potential defeat. Jimmy Carter, of course, George H.W. Bush as well. President Biden has managed to avoid a serious primary challenge, and that is no small feat.
And Jeff, the Democratic and Republican primaries are happening in South Carolina at different times. So we had the Democrats today. The Republican primary in South Carolina is 3 weeks out. Nikki Haley saying that she is going to stay in the race. And of course, South Carolina is her home state. So what are we expecting there on the Republican side?
You're right. On February 24th, that's when Republicans in South Carolina will go to the polls, and that will perhaps be, certainly will be more competitive. Nikki Haley, the former governor there, who served for a couple terms, she is still in this race. She's vowing to stay in this race. Of course, Donald Trump, the overwhelming frontrunner there. But this will show us a lot about the strength of the former president going forward and the willingness for Republicans to get on board behind him. And the margin there, of course, will be very important. These, of course, also have general election implications as well. We've heard that Nikki Haley has been making a general election argument that she can win, she can beat Joe Biden. She has a better chance of doing so, she argues, than Donald Trump. So, of course, the Republican contest will be much more important in terms of the race going forward. So it also is likely to say if there's going to be a rematch for sure. Yes, both sides, the Biden campaign, the Trump campaign, are preparing for a rematch. That certainly looks like what's going to happen. But the South Carolina Republicans still need to vote. Nikki Haley is still in this race. But there's no doubt by the end of February, that vote in South Carolina could set the course for the rest of this 2024 campaign, a likely rematch. So all sides are watching that. But this happens many years. Democrats vote first and Republicans vote a few weeks later. Alex.
And both sides agree that South Carolina is an absolutely critical state. Jeff Zeleny in Washington, thank you very much. Ahead, we will be speaking with a member of the House Intelligence Committee about those airstrikes in Yemen and what they mean for efforts to minimize a potentially growing conflict in the region. Stay with us. And we continue with our coverage of breaking news out of the Middle East tonight. Iran-backed Houthi rebels vowing to retaliate after a new series of airstrikes led by the United States, but a coalition taking part. Joining me now to discuss this is CNN Global Affairs analyst Kim Dozier, former Middle East negotiator for the State Department Aaron David Miller, CNN military analyst Lieutenant General Mark Hertling, and General Wesley Clark. General Clark, let me start with you. When you look at the fact that this was more than 30 different targets across 13 different areas, I believe, what does that tell you about the U.S. efforts that appear to so far have failed to deter the Houthis from carrying out these strikes in the Red Sea?
It says we're getting better targeting information. We're really focusing on collecting intelligence so we can target. And we are ramping up the coercion and the destruction of assets that are there that the Houthis are using. It doesn't say what the end state will be. And you're going against a pretty tough enemy with that. But it's clearly a ramp up in strike.
General Herling, I do want to go on to the other series of strikes that we saw last night. 85 targets, 7 different facilities in both Iraq and in Syria. The Biden administration had made clear that they don't want to escalate the conflict with Iran. But again, they are looking to deter these Iran-backed proxies. So do you think when you look at the targeting that they did last night and how they carried it out, that they are walking that line in the way that they intend to?
I believe they are, Alex. I'm going to jump on what General Clark said, because I admire, first of all, his comments about the end state. You know, what we're seeing right now are the ways that the administration is conducting their operation and the means they're using to do it. Those are 2 elements of strategy. But the key aspect of all of that is, what are they trying to achieve? I believe they're trying to achieve deterrence, but it's going to be very difficult in this area, because you're dealing not only with enemies in Iran, but their proxies in different locations, as well as the connections that Iran has to other nations like Russia, China, North Korea. General Clark addressed that a couple hours ago on your show, and that's a critical element of this. We can't just look at this as a tactical battle and what the administration is attempting to do. They are attempting to deter tactical effects from the Houthis and from the PMFs, but that's going to be very challenging to run that fine thread between deterrence and stumbling into warfare. So far, they've done a good job of that, but we'll see what happens over the next couple of nights as these strikes continue.
Aaron David Miller, the administration has been keen to separate out these different fronts and essentially say what we saw last night in Iraq and Syria, that was about retaliation for the strike in Jordan a week ago. What we're seeing today in Yemen, that is to do with commercial shipping. But in your mind, how much of this is tied back to the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza, and how important is it to get that conflict to a truce, essentially, to avoid inflaming the rest of the region?
Well, I think, thanks for having me, Alan. Look, I think if in fact you can get some sort of de-escalation in Gaza, trade hostages for prisoners, and some measure of stability in Gaza, it's going to be extremely difficult. Hamas and the Israelis, Hamas will survive this. The Israelis will likely be operating at some level in Gaza for months to come. There's no Palestinian Authority to take over, no sense that the Arab states are willing to commit their boots on the ground, and no prospect of a multinational force. Look, Alex, I think we have a strategic problem here. It's as General Herling said, I think is the best tactics that can be deployed under the current circumstances. But we have a strategic problem with Iran, and we don't have a strategic solution. Everything we do with the Iranians is transactional, whether it's diplomatic, it's designed to buy time, the Iran nuclear agreement, or what we're doing now. And I think we may achieve some measure of deterrence and degrading of these proxy forces, but by and large, it's their neighborhood. And the Middle East is literally littered with the remains of great powers, including ours, I might add, who believe that somehow they could impose their will on smaller ones. This region is going to remain, it will not be a land of opportunity for the United States. We're going to have to continue to manage, because the end state here is critically important. And frankly, watching this under Republican and Democratic presidents for 30 years, I'm not sure there is a stable end state.
Kim Dozier, even if Iran has indicated that they don't want to escalate, have they given an indication that they intend to scale back their own activity or want to see their proxies scale back their activity?
Not at all. They've even said things that make it sound like something will be forthcoming, saying that they will not be bullied, and parts of their factions have said they'll meet threats with threats. Look, in Iran's long strategic game, it wants to damage the U.S. reputation. This is payback for U.S. sanctions. This is payback for the U.S. just making lives for Iranians difficult with all of the diplomatic measures it's taken to try to discipline the regime. So every time there's something like what's happening in Gaza right now, it gives Tehran a pretext to put all of those proxy forces in motion, and that's what you're seeing right now. If this results in Iraq, for instance, expelling U.S. troops, because right now the Iraqi government is very angry. They summoned the U.S. charge d'affaires today. They've complained that more than a dozen people from those Iraqi Popular Mobilization Forces, which are partly state-run, were killed in the U.S. strikes on Friday. And if they kick the Americans out, that means Iran has more influence, more freedom to operate throughout Iraq and the rest of the region.
General Clark, you understand the importance of coalitions perhaps better than anybody. Why do you think it's so important for the U.S. to emphasize the need to gather other countries for its campaign now against the Houthis in Yemen?
Because a coalition provides legitimacy. We're using force. It's not a declared war. We're striking. We're killing people. What's the basis for it? We're talking about international law in the case of the Houthis and interference with maritime commerce. So that coalition adds legitimacy to what the United States is doing. And legitimacy is one of the really important elements of a strategy moving forward. But another important element that we don't have under control is the social media and the outreach to the people in the region. We're way behind on that. It may not be possible to make it up. The Iranians and the Palestinians are way, way ahead of us. But we know the leaders in the region, they don't want Iran to be dominant. So we've got to do everything we can to provide legitimacy for what we're doing so they can echo that legitimacy and work their own, let's call it the Arab Street.
Aaron, can you talk to me about the Netanyahu of this all? Of course, Iran is the boogeyman to him. Do you think he is heartened to see the U.S. taking the fight to some of its more prominent proxy groups?
Look, the longer this conflict goes on, both in the region and between Israelis and Palestinians, it carries some risk for Israel. But look, you're dealing with the longest governing prime minister in the history of the state of Israel. He's on trial now for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust in a Jerusalem district court, 3 years in running. He's due to testify next month. He is the worst conceivable leader during a time of crisis because he's conflated his own political future and his freedom. Ehud Olmert went to jail, indicted for a breach of trust for 16 months, a previous Israeli prime minister. So what's at stake for Mr. Netanyahu is his freedom, his political future, and his legacy. And frankly, it's going to be extremely difficult for him to preserve and navigate out of the fix that he's in. The longer this goes on, the more likely there could be some Israeli military success. Maybe they'll kill Yahya Sinwar, military leader of Hamas. But no, again, he's conflated his own politics with the interests of his country, and that's not what you want at this time.
All right, important to note how all of these different fronts are connected. Thanks to you all for your time and your thoughts this evening. Still ahead, what we're learning about when President Biden ordered the strikes in Yemen that took place today, plus what's next for the Biden campaign after his easy win in South Carolina. You're in the CNN Newsroom. We want to get back to the breaking news story unfolding right now in the Middle East. A U.S.-led coalition of countries hit dozens of Houthi targets in Yemen. The president touched down in Los Angeles just a short time ago. He's on his way to a fundraiser following his projected primary victory in South Carolina. CNN's Priscilla Alvarez is with the president in Los Angeles. So, Priscilla, he's focusing on campaigning and raising money, but at the same time, he's got a lot going on in the Middle East.
Yeah, the campaign and the situation in the Middle East really colliding today as we saw those strikes happen earlier today. Now, when those strikes did happen, President Biden was visiting campaign headquarters, again underscoring that as the president hits the trail, he's still having to grapple with this ongoing situation in the Middle East. Now, in terms of the strikes that happened in Yemen, two senior administration officials tell me that President Biden gave the green light for those strikes to occur earlier in the week. Now, the reason for the time difference between Monday and today was because it just takes time sometimes for this to be prepared and carried out. And This is also part of a coalition of countries that have been hitting back against these actions by the Houthis in the Red Sea. They've all warned that these actions, which are targeting U.S. and commercial vessels, could really threaten the global economy. And so the U.S., along with its partner countries, striking back today in this message of deterrence, but also in an attempt to try to degrade and diminish some of those Houthi capabilities. And again, these two senior administration officials also stressing that these strikes are separate from the retaliatory measures that we saw happen on Friday when the U.S. hit targets in Syria and Iraq in response to the death of those 3 service members in Jordan. But of course, Alex, all of this really comes as the Biden administration tries to avoid escalating tensions in the Middle East, getting pulled into a wider war in that region. All of this, they say, is a message of deterrence and not one of escalation.
Separate, but at least connected as far as Iran is concerned. On the campaign front, Priscilla, what is the president now saying about his projected victory in South Carolina?
Well, the president is saying that the state is going to help launch him into 2024. Remember, South Carolina is a state that really turned the tide for President Biden in 2020, and one that he says helped him notch that victory in November of 2020. And leading up to this primary, both the president and the vice president had made frequent trips to the state, including last Saturday when President Biden addressed South Carolina Democrats and made clear that it is voters in that state that have helped him get to the presidency, and that his hope was that they would do it again. But what campaign officials were looking at here was black voter turnout. And we heard earlier in an interview with an interview you had with Michael Tyler, that they did see increased turnout among black voters in this primary. That's a positive sign, because that is support that they cannot afford to lose going into November of 2024. And up until now, polls have showed that there was waning enthusiasm among black voters. And so the campaign really touting these results today. It was, of course, not a competitive primary, but it was a show of the support that the president has among black voters, and one that they aim to keep going into November. Alex.
All right, Priscilla Alvarez in Los Angeles, thank you very much. Let's get straight to Democratic strategist Chuck Rocha and former Republican Congressman Joe Walsh of Illinois. Thank you both for joining me tonight. Chuck, let me start with you and what we're seeing in South Carolina tonight. What are you looking for in the numbers? Because we knew that obviously President Biden was expected to win, but then, as Priscilla was just saying, I had the communications director for the campaign, Michael Tyler, telling me that there was increased black voter turnout.
What I was looking at today was some of it was turnout, but it's hard to measure turnout when you have an incumbent president. Normally in South Carolina and 2 other elections they've had at this time, when there was an incumbent, they didn't even have an election. So what I was looking at is you hear all these people saying, or folks on TV saying, or folks out in the field saying that Biden has got a little weakness within the Democratic Party. So I wanted to see what these other 2, I accept they're lesser candidates. I get that they weren't going to have a job or they weren't going to have a shot, but did they get 5%? Would they get up to 10%? Was there really this angst out there that everybody was talking about? Well, my answers got to me tonight, and they didn't even get 1 or 2%. So it was solid like I needed to see, because turnout will only tell you so much in a primary like this. But what did get to happen as a strategist is the Biden campaign got to test a few apparatuses that they will need in places in the general election where the black vote will be crucial, in places like Philadelphia, Milwaukee, and Detroit. And they got to kick the tires on that truck tonight.
Joe, what do you make of the inroads that Trump is making with black voters in South Carolina and elsewhere? Is that really a voter bloc that he's going to be able to count on?
I think they think so, Alex, and I think they could make some headway here. But to me, the story today is less South Carolina, and it's more game on, general election on. Look, these election numbers between Trump and Biden right now are close because Democrats haven't been engaged and the American people haven't been engaged at all on the notion of a general election. Biden, Trump, here we go again. But Alex, look at what you've been talking about all night. Joe Biden right now, defending American interests in the Middle East, defending commercial shipping, defending Israel. The contrast of that, right, with Donald Trump sitting on his ass in courtroom after courtroom, defending himself, attacking Taylor Swift. Look, I think the contrast now between these two is going to get in front of the American people because now the general election is upon us.
And Chuck, we saw the president in Michigan earlier this week, and that's where he's facing real anger from Arab American voters, Muslim voters over the administration's support for Israel in the war in Gaza. How significant a problem is that going to be for him in the general election?
Look, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. In Michigan, he only won by a small number in the last presidential election. And there are a lot of Muslim Americans in Michigan, in Dearborn, around there. He needs to go there. He needs to sit down with them. He needs to have conversations like he's doing. I give him credit. It's an impossible situation. He's not going to make everybody happy. But if you sit down with folks and you let them know that you care and that you're trying to fix it, it may not be perfect for everybody, but that you're working for a workable solution that's humane and right for everyone. I think that's what they want to hear. And the good news for Democrats and for Joe Biden is he has enough time to fix it.
We did hear from the president at his campaign headquarters. He was rallying support. Here's a little bit of what he had to say.
This is not just a campaign. This is more of a mission. We cannot lose this campaign for the good of the country. It's not about me. It goes well beyond me. It goes about the country. And I think everybody knows it, and I think people are beginning to dawn on people. The American people get it. They understand what's going on. We're going to be able to say, God willing, that this generation help save democracy.
Joe, do you think that argument is gaining traction? Is it a compelling argument that Trump is a threat to democracy?
Absolutely, Alex. That's it. Again, this worked in 2022. This election has to be about Donald Trump. Joe Biden rightly believes that Trump is an existential threat to our democracy. Period. Nothing is more important. I love what Biden said there. It's not about me. It's about defending this democracy. Biden should say that, Alex, every single day for the next 9 months. And when the American people focus on that, that's going to help get Biden reelected.
All right, Joe Walsh, Chuck Rocha, thank you both for your thoughts this evening. Appreciate your time. And we are continuing to follow the escalating conflict in the Middle East after a U.S.-led coalition carried out a series of strikes against the Houthi rebels in Yemen earlier today. Let's discuss more now with Democratic Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi of Illinois, a member of the House Intelligence Committee. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I want to ask you first about these strikes in Yemen. This is the third round of strikes that are led by the U.S. with an international coalition. We know that the Brits took part as well earlier today. This message of deterrence appears to not be getting through. The Houthis continue to carry out these strikes against commercial shipping in the Red Sea. They are continuing to fire missiles, to fire drones. So why have these strikes not been effective? What more does this coalition need to do you think?
Well, I think that they probably are going to need to continue to be vigilant with the coalition in making sure that the Houthis get the message, not just through these missile attacks, but also from others who might have connections to the Houthis in the region, whether it's Iran or others. At the end of the day, however, I think the central issue that the Biden administration is working on right now is dealing with a prolonged pause in the hostilities in Gaza, a release of the hostages, and bringing a little more calm to the region. And so whatever they can do to deal with the Houthis and other militias while not disrupting those negotiations or sparking a regional war is paramount right now.
We are going to see Secretary Blinken going back to the region, including stopping in Israel. How critical do you think it is for the U.S. to help Israel and Hamas get to a point in the fighting where there is a pause in order to see the other flare-ups in the region essentially calm down?
Extremely important. And Bill Burns and Avril Haines briefed our Intelligence Committee just a couple days ago, and Bill Burns, the CIA director, has been playing a big role as well, along with Tony Blinken. I think it's extremely important that there be a temporary ceasefire, a truce, whatever you want to call it, a pause in the fighting so that there can be a release of hostages, a massive inflow of aid to help people in the Gaza Strip, and then a chance at getting to the light at the end of the tunnel, which is a two-state solution. That has to also be, in my humble opinion, on the table as part of the talks, if not part of the current talks, at least in parallel, because we can't go through this endless cycle of violence at this point. That is very important.
You just mentioned that you've been briefed by the senior-most members of the U.S. intelligence community. Help us understand what the U.S. believes Iran's intentions to be, because we kind of decipher their signals, and the general understanding is they don't want a conflict either, but at the same time, they are happy to continue stirring the pot. So what does the intelligence community believe that Tehran actually wants to accomplish here?
Well, as you know, Iran repeatedly provides money, training, and weapons to various militias throughout the Middle East to conduct nefarious activities. One very interesting thing is that a lot of times they know in advance, but sometimes they don't know in advance what these militias are going to do. And so the question here is whether the Iranians are going to actually exercise their leverage and get these militias and proxies to stop this nonsense. This nonsense is going to spark a much wider conflagration that will come back to hurt the Iranians, and they need to realize that. And so at this point, we need to calm the situation, allow for the Israelis and the other parties to have these negotiations for a prolonged pause in hostilities and get to a better place.
So do you think the strikes that we saw last night in Iraq and Syria against these seven different facilities will get to that area where essentially Iran will tell its proxies to dial things back? Is that going to be effective?
Published reports suggest yes, but we don't know exactly. But let me just bring up one other issue, which is very important, which is, I think that it's very important that the president do everything in his power to defend our forces, and he has that right. He has that inherent right under the Constitution. But any kind of extensive offensive operations beyond this would then require that Congress get involved through some kind of authorization of use of military force. And so it's very, very important right now that we also observe that particular issue and not cross a boundary there either.
Iraq has been a vital partner for the U.S. military in terms of combating ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Now we're hearing a lot of anger from the Iraqi government. Many even saying that the U.S. military has to leave Iraq because of the strikes that we have seen by the U.S. in Iraq. Are you concerned that Iraq may essentially kick the U.S. out?
I'm always concerned when a country says that. On the other hand, they have vital security links with the United States. And at the end of the day, if militias are operating from Western Anbar province, attacking American service members, we have the right to defend ourselves.
All right, Congressman Krishnamurthy, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
The mayor of Long Beach says that his city could see more rain this weekend than they do in a typical year ahead. The potentially life-threatening flooding that is bearing down on almost all of California. You can see it right there. Stay with us here in the CNN Newsroom. In California, water rescue teams are on standby tonight as a dangerous atmospheric river bears down on the southern part of the state. Evacuation orders have now been issued for Ventura County and parts of Santa Barbara County as this storm is expected to bring, quote, life-threatening flooding as well as widespread power outages when it makes landfall. That's expected tomorrow. CNN's Camila Bernal joins us now from Los Angeles. So, Camila, this is a huge storm. Are people taking the warning seriously?
Hey, Alex. Yeah, a lot of people definitely are. There are areas where they have those evacuation orders in place, and some people are deciding whether or not they're going to leave their homes. But here, we also saw a lot of people. This is the local fire station, and a lot of people throughout the day coming to just get sandbags because they already know that water either gets into their homes or into their garages. And so people are taking that seriously. Authorities saying, don't travel if you don't have to. Try to have information available. Try to have an emergency kit in place. And they say that they, too, are ready. Take a listen to the fire chief and what she had to say.
We've got our swift water rescue apparatus boats. We also have our teams that will be fully staffed, ready to respond to any water-related emergency. Now, these teams are highly trained in swift water technical rescues. They stand ready to respond on a moment's notice. We've also bolstered our air apparatus, our helicopters, our air resources, adding skilled pilots and rescue teams to our helicopter fleet.
Now, there are also teams ready in case of power outages and downed trees. There are also people who are out right now telling the homeless population to go to a shelter because of the possible dangers of flooding, and everybody overall being told not to drive or walk through flooded areas because those currents can really be unpredictable. And again, authorities just saying take it seriously because it can be dangerous. Alex?
Yeah, hopefully people are heeding those warnings. Camila Bernal, thank you very much. We'll be right back. I want to recap our top story, an escalating situation in the Middle East. A U.S.-led coalition carried out a series of strikes against at least 30 targets tied to Iran-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen earlier today. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin is calling it a clear message and saying the U.S. will not hesitate to defend the free flow of commerce in that vital waterway, the Red Sea. But Iran is warning that the U.S. is fueling further conflict in the region. All of this coming just a day after the U.S. launched strikes against Iran-backed militants in both Iraq and in Syria in response to a deadly drone attack on U.S. troops in Jordan, which left some 3 U.S. service members dead. Thank you very much for joining me this evening. I'm Alex Marquardt. Have a good night.